Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Yusuf Aram. Throughout NATO's 75-year history, Article 5, which guarantees collective defense, has been invoked only once, after the September 11th attacks. NATO members rallied behind the U.S., leading a UN-mandated force in Afghanistan. But this wasn't the scenario for which Article 5 was designed for. Created during the Cold War, it aimed to deter a Soviet invasion of Europe. Now, as current geopolitical tensions echo the past, questions are arising about whether it could be triggered again and under what terms. The war in Ukraine, fueled by NATO's billions in military aid, is testing the alliance's solidarity like never before. Most members back Kiev, but Hungary and Turkey have called for more diplomacy. Russia cites NATO's expansion as its main reason for attacking Ukraine. President Volodymyr Zelensky is pressing for NATO membership while acknowledging Article 5 might not cover all Ukrainian territory. Germany warns Russia sabotage could push NATO to invoke the collective defense clause amid growing hybrid threats. And Vladimir Putin has warned nations supplying weapons to Ukraine that they could be targeted. If NATO does sound the alarm bell, would every member show up? For more, joining me now from London is Elisabeth Braw. She's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. From Brussels, Shea, a former NATO official, and from Skopje, Spasimir Domaradzki. He's a senior analyst at the Institute of Central Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining me. Now, about a year ago, we talked about World War III. Everyone would call me an alarmist, but I feel like it gets thrown around very easily nowadays, like we've kind of accepted our fate. And when we look at the situation in Ukraine, increasing tensions, Elisabeth, I want to start with you. When we look at what's happening in Ukraine now, how close are we to seeing Russia trigger an Article 5 type of scenario?
I think the most frightening thing about the situation is that we don't know what's going on in the heads of Russian leaders. We don't know what they are planning next, simply because we have very little access to them. And that makes it so much harder to calculate what they might decide to do, how they might decide to do it, and when they might decide to do it, and also whether they might decide to challenge us with aggression that is almost an obvious Article 5 sort of scenario, but not quite. And we think we know what an Article 5 scenario is, namely what the North Atlantic Treaty says, namely an armed attack on one or more members of NATO. But what does an armed attack mean? That was clear when the North Atlantic Treaty was signed, not so much anymore.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, the interpretation of armed attack, very different. And Jamie, when we look at Article 5, it looks like it was left kind of vague on purpose, some type of strategic ambiguity maybe in writing it to allow future generations to interpret it the way they want. Do you feel that it is strategic ambiguity? And what right now would constitute a breach of Article 5 that probably wouldn't have constituted it maybe 5, 10, 20 years ago?
Well, firstly, Article 5 was left vague because at the time the treaty was drafted back in 1948-49, the United States did not automatically want to commit to an armed response against an armed attack. It was left, if you like, for the circumstances on the day to decide. But NATO has got round that weakness over the last 75 years by stationing large numbers of American troops in Eastern Europe. There are about 100,000 there today with American ships in Europe, American aircraft. So whatever the treaty says about automaticity, if Putin attacks a NATO country in Eastern Europe, he's going to be up against Americans and American tanks and American aircraft immediately. And it's that really which constitutes the guarantee of a collective response. Putin also knows, with Finland and Sweden now in NATO, that it's a much stronger alliance today than it was 10 or 20 years ago, not just because of new members, but also because it's been preparing for war much more seriously than at any time since the end of the Cold War, with extra defense spending, modernized equipment, troops being deployed in Central and Eastern Europe from a number of NATO countries, regular war games and exercises. So, whatever we may feel about Putin being very unpredictable, and I agree with Elisabeth entirely on that, nonetheless, he knows knows that he's up against an extremely formidable adversary. NATO is not Ukraine. On the other hand, to answer your question very specifically, you're right. Back in 1949, the scenario was very much Soviet tanks crossing borders. It's still perhaps a possibility of Russian tanks crossing borders, but as Elisabeth was referring to, the spectrum of aggression is now broader. It can embrace cyber attacks. NATO has said since 2018 that a cyber attack could also trigger, if it's bad enough, an Article 5 collective response. NATO has done this with terrorism by going to Afghanistan after the 9/11 Al-Qaeda attacks, and today it also applies to other critical infrastructure like satellites in space. But at the end of the day, it's up to the 32 allies to decide if it's an Article 5 or not an Article 5. There's no, if you like, a blueprint or automaticity about any of this.
Mm-hmm. Spasimir, geographically, you're a little closer to Russia. You're located more on the eastern flank of the transatlantic alliance. What is the conversation like in North Macedonia regarding the possibility of Article 5 being triggered? Is this something that's being talked about?
No, I wouldn't say that this is a matter that seriously concerns or is in the focus of the public debate. However, I think that it is important to highlight a couple of things that were mentioned already. Because first and foremost, I think that actually Article 5 is much less ambiguous than we paint it. It has certain very clear elements that we need to highlight. First and foremost, we need to remember that NATO is a defense treaty. And as such, the nature of its functioning ultimately aims at the protection of the territory of its member states. In other words, when we contemplate about the further escalation of the conflict in Ukraine, we observe two things. First of all, there is a very careful approach on both sides, both of NATO and of the Russians, when it comes to the relationship. And on the other hand, of course, we are in the heated phase of a new Cold War, where we have provocations, we have numerous cases that could serve as a casus belli. But they're not enough, and there is no political will to push the world in that direction. In other words, especially when we think from Central and Eastern European perspective, there is a lot of consciousness. On one hand, we are aware why there is a need for the tangible and consistent presence of NATO military infrastructure, of defense capabilities. But on the other hand, there is absolute awareness at the same time that there is a need to very carefully approach the relations with Russia and not give any arguments that could be interpreted in the wrong way by Moscow.
Mm-hmm. Elisabeth, now, NATO, there's no voting. There's consultations until a consensus is reached. So everybody has to be on board inside the transatlantic alliance. I always think that's one of the very unique and attractive parts of NATO that other organizations really don't have. Now, the way Article 5 could be triggered, obviously cyber attack was mentioned, maybe a NATO ally attacking and a retaliation, would that trigger it? What type of scenarios do you think could have a consensus and might not reach a consensus to trigger Article 5?
What is indisputable is that if there's a large-scale military attack on one or more NATO allies, then all the member states would be extremely likely that this is to agree that this is an Article 5 scenario. But we've already seen a number of situations where it was definitely an attack on NATO territory, and some member states made the case that it's an Article 5 type scenario, but they were in the vast minority. So one example is the altercation at the Polish border, where a Polish border guard was stabbed to death by a migrant on the Belarusian side who had been brought there as part of the weaponization of migration instigated by the Belarusian authorities. NATO always says we defend every inch of square territory. This border guard was on the Polish side of the border. He was killed while carrying out his duties. And so you could argue this is an Article 5 scenario. Somebody representing the Polish state in the protection of its borders was killed while executing those duties. And yet it would be extremely unlikely to get 32 NATO member states to agree that NATO should retaliate. And this is what Russia and indeed Belarus and increasingly other countries are getting very good at exploiting. And we are seeing it with undersea infrastructure. That is these attacks have taken place in the exclusive economic zones of Sweden, Finland, and other countries. We have seen Russia altering the maritime border in the Narva River by removing the buoys that constitute that maritime border in the Narva River. But it's not one of those totally obvious assaults on NATO member states, so they haven't been treated as Article 5 situations. So we'll see many more of them, simply because you can keep engaging in such aggression and such attacks with impunity, or at least with very few repercussions.
Mm-hmm. Jamie, I want to give another example. For example, 2015, the Russian jet that was shot down by the Turks, it was deemed not to pass the threshold of Article 5 on the other side of the Turkish border, very slightly. If that jet had been shot down a minute or 2 minutes later after it crossed into Turkish territory, do you think that would have triggered an Article 5? Or would it have been deemed it's only one jet, it's not too serious, no reason to trigger Article 5?
Yes, as Elisabeth was saying, there is a certain degree of ambiguity in this because, as I said earlier, everything is situation dependent. For an Article 5 to be triggered, I think there has to be evidence of a deliberate attack. Russia or some other state has set out really to deliberately attack NATO to cause massive damage. It's totally unprovoked because, as was said also by your other guest, NATO is a defensive alliance. And therefore, it's a clear case, which also fits into the plans that NATO has elaborated, its regional defence plans, to respond to different types of scenario. Where the incident does not fit into those preconceived scenarios, and therefore is not going to have an automatic pre-prepared response, then obviously it depends on many factors. Number one, is NATO certain that it was deliberate? Or it could have been an accident, like a Russian aircraft accidentally for a few seconds straying into Turkish airspace. It's very difficult to go to war for a miscalculation or something that was not deliberate. Is the country which is affected actually calling for Article 5 to be invoked? Elisabeth gave the Polish example, you've just given a Turkish example. I was at NATO for 38 years before I stepped down, and in that time I didn't see these countries coming to NATO demanding that the other allies immediately declare an Article 5 and take retaliatory measures. Often the country concerned, in this case Turkey, was very keen to de-escalate, obviously not to cause an incident, to send a signal that it didn't want its airspace to be violated. But relations between Turkey and Russia have been better than relations between Russia and many other NATO allies, and therefore it was a diplomatic calculation as well. Did lots of people get killed? Clearly not, at least on the NATO side in this particular case. But what Elisabeth was saying earlier, I think, does go in the right direction. The fact of the matter is NATO can't just be an Article 5 alliance. It can't say, oh, we're going to sit back and do absolutely nothing and be completely passive unless the aggression or the provocation is of a certain extreme kind in which missiles are being fired on us and hundreds of our citizens are being killed. Because the nature of hybrid warfare, the kind of things that were being discussed, the sabotage operations, the political interference operations, the disinformation, the cyber attacks, they are well below that level, but they still cause disruption and inconvenience. So what NATO is doing, and what I was working working on when I was still a NATO official, is what we call a toolbox of response options below Article 5, which does not mean going to war, but which means nonetheless exacting a cost, exacting a price on the aggressor.
Jamie said NATO shouldn't just be an Article 5 alliance. And I think kind of in that spirit, NATO members individually have been supplying more advanced weapons to Ukraine. But at the same time, Russian President Vladimir Putin saying countries that are supplying these weapons, and especially the more advanced ones where people from or professionals from NATO member countries that are deploying them and using them, operating them, those countries are legitimate targets. Now, do you think that in the rules of engagement, they are legitimate targets? And if they are legitimate targets, if Russia attacks, is that an attack? Is that a counterattack? How does NATO view that? I mean, I know this is a lot of gray areas, but that's exactly why I have you three here to discuss all this.
But that's an excellent question. First of all, we should not lose from our eyesight the fact that actually NATO is backing up a country that is a victim of an open aggression that violates all the principles of international law and of the United Nations. And in that sense, when we listen to Putin, we need to be very careful and to distill the political rhetoric from the practical capabilities. If that was the case, and of course Putin loves to play that game over the last 2 years, he would have thousands of reasons already to do something, and it is apparent that every next step that the West does and deteriorates his tactical position in Ukraine or creates more or increases the cost of his aggression is subject to criticism and threatening. And at the same time, we need to be aware that coming back to our discussion on the nature of NATO, again, if we hook to Article 5, one thing that is very interesting is that whereas and it was already mentioned, the article was written in the context of the Cold War, and there was no doubt what would mean at that time attack on one for all. After the end of the Cold War, we had an enormous evolution of the alliance. It went even to this formula of out of area or out of office dilemma in order to end up again as a typical classical defense alliance. And in that sense, we know and this is, I think, the cornerstone of this expectation of all member states, that there is an additional backup if something wrong happens. But at the same time, the logic of the alliance is that every single country, first and foremost, needs to have the capabilities to defend itself alone. And the sum of these capabilities is what provides the NATO strength. And we see how strongly the countries of Central and Eastern Europe are now active in terms of investing in their military capabilities, because whether we like it or not, the political reality in Central and Eastern Europe has changed dramatically, and there needs to be an adjustment.
Elisabeth, German intel chief said that sabotage can trigger Article 5. I know we touched a little on cyber attacks, but when you look at this statement, I mean, there's obviously seems to be, I don't want to call it a mission creep, but a expanded interpretation again. And again, that's why I have you three experts to sit there and game this out, how this would work. What type of sabotage, what type of cyber attack? For example, if there was a nuclear attack on Ukraine, if that fallout from the nuclear fallout shifted into a neighboring country, caused damage, does that trigger Article 5 in your mind? What are your thoughts on this?
Where it has to start is that the NATO member states decide collectively what is the threshold below the Article 5 threshold that they consider unacceptable. And then they should communicate that, but they shouldn't communicate it so clearly that they say, oh, this type of attack will trigger a response from us and this kind of attack will not, because then you can be sure that the Russians and others will go for the kind of attack which we have said will trigger no response. And I remember a couple of years ago or a few years ago now, when I was writing a book book called The Defender's Dilemma about exactly these issues. I struggled with the definition of what that lower threshold should be. For a while, I thought it should be the loss of life. So if one citizen or resident of a NATO member state loses his or her life as a result of non-military or hybrid or gray zone aggression, then NATO should respond. But then again, I discarded that idea because I realized that you can have enormous disruption and harm to our countries that comes with no single life lost, but is the equivalent in destruction of a military attack. So I still don't know what the threshold should be, but I do know that NATO member states should decide on it collectively and then communicate it so that Russia and others know what we consider unacceptable, so that they don't try it, because it's better for us that they don't try it than that they try it and we then have to retaliate, because that could lead to escalation.
Mm-hmm. Jamie, let's say the 32 heads of the Transatlantic Alliance come together. They've reached a consensus. Article 5 is triggered. Now, you're a former NATO official. What's the mechanism? What's the process once it's been triggered? Is there a plan inside of NATO? Is there a roadmap, what comes next inside of NATO? Or is it just spur of the moment improvise?
Well, there are two types of scenario. One is the more classical military aggression that we were talking about earlier. And here, yes, since Russia annexed Crimea back in 2014, NATO has really gone back into planning and rehearsing for collective defense and collective response. Many countries have put troops into Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, Romania. We have now got, NATO, a much stronger forward presence on the border so that the Russians would not have the option of taking territory, and then NATO would have to try to reconquer it later. That would always be highly destructive and would take a long time. So deny Russia the ability to seize territory, be able to respond immediately. NATO has come up with very extensive reinforcement plans to get troops quickly across Europe, from the United States, Canada, across the Atlantic, so that they can quickly parry any advances by Russia or in any hostile power, and mentioned the regional plans, which now give every ally, for the first time since the Cold War, its assigned role. You've got to be there on day one with 600 tanks and et cetera, and NATO is now basically doing all of its capability development to make sure that it has the troops and the capabilities to execute in full those plans. So that is pretty sort of straightforward. The other type of scenario, though, is the below the Article 5 threshold, where clearly there is discretion for NATO to decide whether something is an Article 5 or not. For example, before the 9/11 terrorist attacks against New York and Washington back in 2001, very few of us, including myself, would have guessed that NATO would invoke Article 5 for the first time in its history, not for a Soviet attack in Europe, but for an attack by Al-Qaeda coming out of Afghanistan against the United States.
Almost 8 decades ago, NATO was created just for this moment. So let's say the alarm bells are ringing in 32 countries, Article 5's triggered. Is everyone showing up? Is everyone grabbing their guns, blazing towards Russia? Or are some countries like, okay, Article 5's triggered, but I think I'm going to sit this one out. I don't really want to become a Russian target, or I don't want to participate in this?
It's an excellent question. Of course, it is a matter of, ultimately, it is a matter of countries' choices, but we need to be aware of one thing. Indeed, first of all, I silently hope that this article was not made for that moment, but if we're still in this level of intellectual speculation, the Article 5 does not assume that all the countries are the ones go to war. The countries have the choice to decide how they can assist the country that is attacked. Of course, in the context of the current geopolitical crisis, we can paint pictures that include a full-scale war between the two two sides, but we can also imagine a locally concentrated, and I would probably go more into that direction. The West still hopes that there will be an element of reason in what Moscow does. Regardless of this hope, we at the same time, we need to be prepared, because as we see, this is one of the most serious moments in the international relations after the end of the Second World War.
Spasimir, Jamie, Elisabeth, thank you for helping me game out this scenario, which I think we all agree we hope we never have to see become a reality. And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Yusuf Aram. If you got any comments, please share them with us on X at Straight Talk TRT. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, take care and goodbye.